the shadows outside. It all started as a joke between me, my friend Rachel, and her cousin Jess. We were staying at a cabin deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. Rachel's family owned the place, and every year they used it for quiet getaways. But this time, we weren't looking for peace and quiet. We were here for the thrill. Rachel had smuggled in an old Ouija board from her attic, eager to see if we could make contact with something beyond. The night we decided to use it was cold and still, the sky overcast, blanketing everything in darkness. The only sounds were the occasional creak of the trees and the soft rush of the wind against the cabin. We set the board on the coffee table in the main room, candles casting eerie shadows on the walls. "Are you sure about this?" I asked, nervously eyeing the board. Rachel shrugged. "Oh, come on, it'll be fun. We'll probably just end up spooking ourselves for no reason." Jess laughed, though her voice was shaky. "Yeah, it's just a board, right?" But I could tell she was nervous too. We placed our fingers lightly on the planchette, exchanging uneasy glances as Rachel took the lead. "Is there anyone here with us?" she asked, her voice soft but clear. For a moment, nothing happened. I felt a flicker of relief, convinced that nothing would come of this. But then the planchette moved, sliding slowly across the board until it landed on yes. I stared, wide-eyed, at Rachel and Jess, both of whom looked just as shocked as I felt. You guys aren't moving it, right?" I whispered. They both shook their heads, looking equally horrified. Rachel swallowed, her voice trembling. "Well, what's your name?" The planchette moved again, this time spelling out Mortis. I felt a chill run down my spine. The name felt dark, wrong, like it carried a weight of something ancient and angry. Jess glanced at us, her face pale. Maybe we should stop. But Rachel seemed transfixed, as if compelled by the presence we'd invited in. "Why are you here?" she asked. The planchette moved faster this time, almost aggressively. "Dark. Dark?" I repeated, my voice barely audible. "What does that mean?" Before anyone could respond, the wind outside picked up, howling against the walls of the cabin. The lights flickered, and I thought I heard something scratching against the windows. Rachel pulled her hand away, looking suddenly afraid. Maybe we should say goodbye." But Jess shook her head, frowning. "Wait, let's just ask one more question." She placed her fingers back on the planchette, and reluctantly, Rachel and I joined her. "Mortis, what do you want?" Jess asked, her voice shaky. The planchette moved almost immediately, spelling out a single word. "Souls." The word hung in the air, heavy with dread. We sat in stunned silence, barely daring to breathe. The room felt colder, and the flickering candlelight cast long shadows over our faces. And then, the lights went out completely, plunging us into darkness. Rachel fumbled for her phone, turning on the flashlight. "Okay, that's enough. Let's say goodbye and end this." But before we could move the planchette, a loud bang echoed from the window, followed by a scratching sound that made my skin crawl. I turned toward the sound, my heart pounding, and saw a face. Pressed against the glass was a pale, distorted face, eyes hollow, and mouth stretched into an unnatural, toothy grin. Its skin was splotchy, almost decayed, and it was staring directly at me. I screamed, stumbling backward as Rachel and Jess turned to look. Their gasps echoed mine as more faces appeared at the other windows, leering at us with grotesque expressions. They pressed against the glass, some tapping with sharp, bony fingers, their mouths moving soundlessly. Jess was sobbing, clutching her knees. What are they?" I forced myself to look away from the windows, feeling my stomach churn with terror. We didn't say goodbye. We never ended it. The planchette moved on its own, jerking wildly across the board, spelling out a message we could barely keep up with. You are mine. The shadows around the room seemed to grow thicker, pooling like ink along the floor, creeping toward us. The air felt heavy, pressing down on my chest, and the scratching grew louder, more frantic, as if the things outside were trying to break in. Rachel gripped my arm, her face pale with terror. What do we do? Say goodbye, I yelled, placing my hands back on the planchette. We have to end it. Rachel and Jess joined me, and we pushed the planchette toward goodbye. But just as we were about to reach it, a force yanked our hands off, slamming the planchette back to the center. The cabin shook, objects rattling on the shelves as the wind howled around us. The figures at the windows pounded harder, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. One of them opened its mouth, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and let out a shrill scream that pierced the silence. The door to the cabin flew open, and a powerful gust of wind extinguished the candles. I could see shapes in the darkness, shadows shifting and writhing, as though the things from outside had finally found their way in. A deep, rumbling voice echoed through the room, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Your souls are forfeit. The figures outside pressed closer, their faces pressed flat against the glass, distorted and monstrous. The scratching grew louder, and the planchette started moving on its own, violently spelling out the same word over and over. Mine, mine, mine. The cabin shook harder, the very walls seeming to pulse with a dark energy. I felt something cold brush against my arm, like skeletal fingers tracing my skin. I screamed, pulling away, but the touch followed, crawling up my arm. I grabbed the planchette, desperately trying to force it to goodbye. Rachel and Jess were both crying, their hands shaking as they joined me. We pushed with all our strength, fighting against the invisible force that resisted us, and finally, with one last shove, we moved the planchette to goodbye. The scratching stopped. The figures outside vanished, leaving nothing but smeared handprints on the glass. The oppressive weight lifted, and the room fell silent, leaving only the sound of our ragged breathing. We sat there staring at the board, too shaken to move. Jess broke the silence, her voice barely a whisper. Did we get rid of it? I glanced around the room, half expecting the shadows to start moving again. I think so. But even as I said it, a flicker of doubt lingered. We'd closed the session, yes, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us. Something dark and patient, waiting for another chance. That night I tried to sleep, but I couldn't shake the memory of those faces at the window, their hollow eyes and twisted smiles. I kept hearing the scratching sound, faint but persistent, as if they were still out there, waiting for another invitation. The next morning we packed up and left the cabin, none of us daring to look back. I haven't touched a Ouija board since, but sometimes, late at night, I hear that same scratching sound at my bedroom window, and every time I wonder if one of those faces is out there, watching, waiting for me to let it back in. Echoes of the forgotten. It all started as a joke. Just a few girls, a bottle of wine, and a dusty Ouija board we found tucked away in Lauren's old creaky house. It was one of those sprawling Victorian-era places that had been in her family for generations, filled with antique furniture and strange corners that felt colder than they should. A house with history, Lauren had called it. and for some reason, that made the idea of using the board seem even better. We were all in our early 20s, taking a break from college stress to hang out in her family's old house, a little bit tipsy, a little bit daring. It was me, Lauren, and Bailey, 3 girls with more confidence than sense. The board was a relic, cracked around the edges and smelling faintly of something damp. Bailey laughed as she spread it out on the floor, lighting a few of the old candles we'd found in a drawer. "Let's see if we can actually make this thing work," she said, her smile wide and a little mischievous. Lauren rolled her eyes. "It's just a game, right?" I shrugged, trying to look braver than I felt. "Right, let's get on with it then." We placed our fingers lightly on the planchette, snickering, trying to hold back the shivers that prickled over our skin as we asked, "Is anyone here with us?" The planchette moved, gliding smoothly over the board as if pulled by some unseen hand. We exchanged glances, nervously laughing, each of us trying to convince ourselves that someone else was pushing it. It settled on yes. We paused, exchanging wary looks. "You moved it, didn't you?" I asked, trying to sound calm. "No way," Bailey said, her face serious. Lauren just shook her head, her fingers trembling slightly. "Who are you?" Lauren asked, her voice barely a whisper. The planchette didn't hesitate, moving quickly to spell out a name. MIA. "Mia," Bailey whispered, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. We didn't know any Mia, but it was a common enough name. I figured maybe one of us had it in mind without realizing it. "What do you want, Mia?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The answer spelled out slowly, each letter heavy and deliberate. "Help." Cold chill swept over me. We looked at each other, unsure of what to say next. I wanted to end the game, but some strange curiosity kept me there. I glanced at Lauren, who had gone pale, her eyes fixed on the board. How can we help?" Lauren whispered, almost as if she didn't want an answer. "Remember," it spelled, each letter dragging as if something struggled to make itself understood. "Remember," Bailey repeated, her face scrunched in confusion. "What are we supposed to remember?" But before we could get an answer, a gust of cold wind blew through the room, snuffing out the candles. The only light came from the thin line of moonlight spilling through the dusty window. We sat in silence, barely daring to breathe. "Let's just say goodbye and end this," I whispered, feeling the weight of the darkness pressing down on us. But as we tried to move the planchette to goodbye, it wouldn't budge, as if some invisible force held it in place. A chill settled over my spine and my heart pounded in my chest. "Mia, are you still here?" Lauren asked hesitantly. The planchette moved, quickly this time, gliding across the board with a terrifying urgency. "Don't leave." The words made my blood run cold. "We're ending this," I said, more to myself than to anyone else. I forced my fingers to push the planchette toward goodbye, but it moved away, resisting, as if it had a mind of its own. "Please, we're done," Bailey whimpered, her voice barely audible. The room grew colder, and then we heard it, a soft, whispering voice, so faint that I almost thought I was imagining it. "Remember." The word was a breath, a hint of something long forgotten, but filled with desperation. I glanced at the other girls, who were pale, their eyes wide with terror. None of us dared to speak, too afraid of what might happen next. "We have to finish this," I whispered, my voice trembling. I tried again to move the planchette to goodbye, but it remained rooted in place. Then came a tapping, slow and deliberate, echoing from the floor above us. Tap, tap, tap. We all froze, staring at the ceiling, listening as the tapping grew louder, as if something were moving across the floor, coming closer, step by step. Lauren's hand gripped mine, and I could feel her shaking. "That's my parents' room," she whispered. "No one's been up there for weeks." The tapping stopped, and silence filled the room once more. I felt the urge to run, to flee the room and leave the board behind. But something held me there, a strange, terrifying curiosity mingling with the fear. The planchette moved again, spelling out a new message. In the walls, I pulled my hands back, almost laughing from the absurdity of it. But the sound died in my throat. In the dim light, I could see Lauren's face, pale and drawn, her eyes fixed on the board with a strange expression. "I remember," she whispered, so softly that I barely heard her. "What are you talking about?" Bailey asked, her voice thin and frightened. Lauren's hand trembled as she lifted it to her mouth, her eyes wide. "When I was little, my mum used to tell me stories about this girl named Mia. She was my grandmother's cousin, and she vanished." "What happened to her?" I asked, barely able to get the words out. Lauren shook her head. "No one ever knew. They said she ran away, but my grandma, she always said Mia never left the house." The tapping sound resumed, louder this time, and closer. It echoed through the walls, like fingers dragging along wood, searching, probing. "Please, help me." The whisper was louder this time, desperate and filled with sorrow. "Goodbye," I said again, frantically trying to push the planchette, but it wouldn't move. Then the room grew colder, and a figure appeared at the edge of the candlelight. It was a faint, shimmering outline of a young woman, her eyes hollow, her mouth open in a silent scream. She looked at us, her gaze fixed on Lauren, as if recognizing her. Lauren's eyes filled with tears, and she reached out a trembling hand. "Mia?" The figure nodded, and the tapping grew louder, more insistent, echoing through the walls like a heartbeat. "Help me," she whispered again, her voice filled with despair. I can't. Find peace." "What do we do?" Bailey cried, her voice choked with fear. "Finish it," I whispered, feeling the urgency in the air, the weight of decades of silence and sorrow pressing down on us. With trembling hands, we placed our fingers on the planchette one last time. "Goodbye," we whispered together, pushing it with all our strength. This time, it moved, sliding smoothly to the word as if something had finally let go. The figure faded, and the tapping stopped. Silence fell over the room, thick and heavy, but strangely comforting. The chill lifted, and the candles flickered back to life, casting a warm glow over us. We sat there, breathing heavily, each of us too shaken to speak. In the distance, we heard a faint sigh, as if the house itself were finally at peace. Lauren looked at us, her face pale but relieved. "She's gone," she whispered. We packed up the board, putting it away for good, and left the house, each of us carrying a piece of that night with us forever. The Uninvited Guest. I'll never forget the night we decided to try contacting spirits in the old barn on Ava's family farm. It was Ava's idea. She had always been obsessed with ghost stories, and when she unearthed her grandmother's Ouija board from their attic, she couldn't resist the temptation. We thought it would be fun, a chance to scare ourselves for a few laughs. But none of us were prepared for what we'd awaken that night. It was me, Ava, and Chloe. We were best friends, practically inseparable since middle school. Ava led us into the barn, her flashlight bobbing in the darkness as she pushed open the creaky door. The The place was enormous, dusty, and filled with the smell of hay and something old, like the earth itself. Ava cleared a spot in the middle, lighting a few tea candles in a circle around us. "So, are we really doing this?" Chloe asked, sounding a bit more nervous than usual. She wasn't the type to scare easily, but the barn had a strange, heavy feeling that night, like it was waiting. "Of course we are," Ava replied, already setting the board on the floor. She placed the planchette in the center, giving us a look of excitement that did nothing to ease my nerves. "Come on, it'll be fun." We sat down, placing our fingers lightly on the planchette, our breaths barely stirring the heavy air. "Is anyone here with us?" Ava called out, her voice echoing in the hollow silence. At first, nothing happened. We looked at each other, trying not to laugh, half relieved that the board seemed to be just a piece of wood after all. But then, the planchette moved, gliding slowly to yes. A shiver crawled down my spine, and I pulled my hand back instinctively. "Did one of you just..." Both Ava and Chloe shook their heads, looking just as spooked as I felt. "Maybe there is someone," Chloe whispered, glancing nervously around the darkened barn. "Maybe it's just Ava's grandma." Ava looked at the board, her fingers trembling slightly. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice lower now. The planchette moved again, quicker this time, spelling out, "Stay away." The three of us exchanged looks, each of us more unsettled than the last. "Is this some kind of joke?" I asked, my voice louder than I intended. "It's not me," Ava said, her face pale. She looked down at the board, her lips pressed tightly together. "What do you mean? Why should we stay away?" The planchette was silent, frozen for a moment, before it began to move again. This time it spelled out a word that made my heart skip a beat. "Demon." Chloe laughed, but it sounded forced. "Okay, that's enough. Let's stop before we really freak ourselves out." But Ava's gaze stayed fixed on the board. "Are you a demon?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Nothing happened. The barn was silent, almost suffocatingly so. I wanted to leave, but something kept me rooted there, like the darkness itself held us in place. Then, from somewhere in the shadows of the barn, came a faint scratching sound. It was soft, barely noticeable at first, but it grew louder, more insistent, until it filled the silence like nails scraping against metal. We huddled closer together, eyes wide as we peered into the darkness beyond the candlelight. The scratching stopped, and the planchette moved once more, spelling out a message that made my blood run cold. "I'm here." My breath caught in my throat. "I think we should go," I whispered, gripping Ava's arm. But Ava shook her head. "We haven't said goodbye yet. We need to end this properly, or..." Her voice trailed off as she glanced around, fear flashing in her eyes. Chloe looked at me, her face tense. "Do we really have to?" "Yes," Ava insisted. "We have to say goodbye." We tried to move the planchette to goodbye, but it wouldn't budge. No matter how hard we pushed, it stayed locked in place, like something held it there. "Please, just let us leave!" Chloe cried out, her voice breaking. A chill swept through the barn, colder than any wind, freezing us to the bone. And then we saw it. A shadow in the corner, darker than the night, slowly taking shape. It was tall, unnaturally thin, with elongated limbs that stretched toward us, almost like it was reaching. We all screamed, scrambling backward, but the shadow seemed to follow us, its movement slow and deliberate. I could feel my pulse hammering in my chest as we backed away, unable to tear our eyes from the thing in the corner. "Go!" I shouted, grabbing Chloe's arm as I pulled her toward the barn door. But before we could reach it, the planchette moved on its own, gliding across the board with terrifying speed. I warned you. The shadow loomed closer, its shape shifting and twisting, filling the barn with an overwhelming sense of dread. The candles flickered, their flames barely clinging to life, casting shadows that danced and stretched across the walls. Ava stumbled, falling to her knees in front of the board. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Please, let us go." The scratching sound resumed, louder and closer than ever. It echoed around us, filling every corner of the barn until it felt like it was coming from inside our own heads. And then, in one final act of desperation, Ava grabbed the planchette, forcing it to the word goodbye. Instantly, the scratching stopped, the shadow retreating, fading into the darkness as if it had never been there at all. We sat in stunned silence, each of us too shaken to move. Finally, Chloe broke the silence, her voice trembling. What was that?" I shook my head, still trying to process what we'd just experienced. Ava looked at the board, her face pale and drawn, and whispered, "Something that doesn't want to be found." We left the board in the barn, too afraid to bring it back with us. To this day, I don't know what we summoned that night, and I don't think I want to know. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that scratching sound echoing in my mind, and I wonder if we really left it behind. The haunting question. It was supposed to be an ordinary Friday night, just me, my best friend Lily, and her cousin Nora hanging out at Lily's house while her parents were away for the weekend. We'd planned a simple night of horror movies and snacks, but then Nora pulled a dusty Ouija board from her bag, a mischievous smile lighting up her face. "I found this at an estate sale last weekend," she said, brushing off some cobwebs. "The woman who sold it to me said it was over a century old." I shot Lily a wary look. Are you sure that thing's safe?" "It's just a game," Lily said with a laugh, though her eyes darted to the board with a hint of nervousness. "It's not like it actually works, right?" But Nora seemed dead serious. "There's only one way to find out." She set the board down on the living room floor, and we gathered around, our fingers hovering over the planchette. I couldn't help but feel a strange, almost magnetic pull toward it, as if the board itself wanted us to begin. "So, what do we ask?" Nora said, a little too eager. Lily grinned. "Maybe something like, 'Is there anyone here with us?'" The second the words left her mouth, the planchette began to move, slowly gliding to yes. My heart skipped a beat, and I looked between them, but both seemed as shocked as I was. "Okay, very funny. Which one of you moved it?" I asked. "Not me," Lily protested, looking genuinely spooked. Nora shook her head, her eyes wide with excitement. Nora leaned forward, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "Let's ask its name," she asked. "What's your name?" The planchette paused, as if considering, then began to move, its journey across the board almost unnervingly deliberate. "Eliza. Eliza," I repeated, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. The name lingered in the air, almost like it belonged to someone standing right there, just beyond the circle of light cast by the dim lamp. "Did you live here, Eliza?" Nora asked, a hint of curiosity in her voice. The planchette moved to no. I felt a wave of relief, but it was short-lived. The planchette moved again, spelling something else with eerie speed. "She is here." A cold shiver ran down my back. She is here?" I echoed, glancing at Lily, who looked as unsettled as I felt. Nora, unfazed, leaned in closer. "What do you mean, Eliza? Who is here?" But the planchette didn't move. Instead, an unnatural silence settled over the room, thick and suffocating. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then we heard a soft creak from somewhere upstairs, followed by what sounded like footsteps. Lily grabbed my arm, her face paling. "Did you hear that?" We sat frozen, listening as the footsteps moved slowly across the floor above us, pacing back and forth, each step deliberate, as if something, or someone, was wandering the house. "Lily," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. "Your parents aren't home, right?" She shook her head, eyes wide. "No one else should be here." Nora looked down at the board, her face a mixture of fascination and fear. "Maybe it's Eliza, or whoever she's talking about." The footsteps stopped, and the silence returned, pressing down on us like a weight. I tried to move the planchette to goodbye, but it wouldn't budge, as if glued to the board. Lily's voice trembled. "Eliza, is someone else here with us?" The planchette began to move again, this time faster, as if in a frenzy, spelling out 2 words over and over. "Help me! Help me!" The repetition made my blood run cold. "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Help her. How?" But the board had other plans. It moved again, almost violently, its message unmistakable. "Get out!" A chill swept over us, and then, as if on cue, the lights flickered. The room dimmed until only shadows remained, stretching across the walls like dark tendrils. I glanced at Lily, who was clutching my arm. Maybe we should listen to her. Just as we decided to get up, the planchette jerked under our fingers, almost as if it was trying to hold us in place. We let go, but the planchette continued to move on its own, tracing a strange, twisting path around the board until it spelled out, "Don't leave." Lily's face went white. She doesn't want us to leave." "I think we should go anyway," I muttered. But Nora's gaze was fixed on the board, her face unreadable. "Eliza," she asked softly, "why don't you want us to go?" The planchette moved in a quick, desperate motion, spelling out a new message. "Danger." Suddenly, from the shadows near the doorway, a figure appeared. It was tall, unnaturally thin and cloaked in darkness, its features obscured by shadows. It stood silently, watching us, its presence cold and menacing. I grabbed Lily's hand, pulling her to her feet. "We need to get out of here, now!" But the figure took a step forward, then another, each movement slow and purposeful. The air around us grew colder, heavy with the scent of decay, like something that had been dead for a long, long time. The board's planchette moved on its own, one last time, its final message clear and chilling. "Run!" That was all the encouragement we needed. We bolted, practically tripping over each other in our rush to get out of the room. I glanced back only once, just in time to see the figure standing over the Ouija board, its eyes, cold and empty, fixed on us. We didn't stop running until we were out of the house, standing breathlessly in the yard, trying to process what had just happened. "What? What was that?" Lily whispered, her voice shaky. Nora looked back at the house, her face pale. "I don't know, but I don't think it was Eliza." We never did find out who or what was with us in that room, but sometimes I'll get chills for no reason, or feel a faint whisper brush against my ear in an empty room. And I wonder if we really escaped that night, or if something followed us home. The secret of the board. When Tom first suggested we try using a Ouija board, I laughed it off. We'd been dating for 2 years, and I knew he was the kind of guy who'd suggest something like this just to get a reaction out of me. But he seemed genuinely interested. Said he'd found an old board in the attic of his grandmother's house, covered in dust and cobwebs. He thought it might make a fun, spooky night. "Come on, Sarah," he teased, holding up the box with a grin. "Aren't you curious?" I sighed, playfully rolling my eyes. "Only if you promise not to try to freak me out," I replied, though my stomach was doing uneasy flips. I'd always had a weird feeling about Ouija boards, like they were better left untouched. We sat on the living room floor, a couple of candles flickering nearby for atmosphere. Tom set the board between us and placed the planchette in the center, then glanced at me, a mischievous glint in his eyes. "All right," he said, "let's do this. Are you ready?" I took a deep breath and placed my fingers lightly on the planchette alongside his, feeling a strange thrill of anticipation. "Ready." He cleared his throat, adopting a more serious tone. "Is there anyone here with us?" he asked, his voice echoing in the quiet room. For a moment, nothing happened. We looked at each other, a little relieved, when suddenly the planchette began to move. I shot Tom a suspicious look, but he looked just as surprised as I was. The planchette slid to yes. My heart raced, but I forced myself to stay calm. "You're not doing that, right?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "No way," he murmured, eyes wide. We sat in silence, our breaths held as he asked the next question. "Who are you?" The planchette moved again, spelling out Sophia. "Sophia," I repeated, feeling a chill creep over me. I'd never heard of anyone named Sophia in Tom's family. Do you know her?" He shook his head slowly, his brow furrowed. "No, at least I don't think so." We exchanged uneasy glances, but curiosity got the better of us. "Sophia, why are you here?" I asked. The board was silent for a moment, but then the planchette moved, its movement slow and deliberate. "Help." A shiver ran down my spine. "Help with what?" I asked, feeling an edge of fear creep into my voice. The board replied, "Secret." "Secret," Tom said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What kind of secret?" I was starting to feel uncomfortable, but I couldn't pull my hands away. The planchette continued moving, spelling out one word at a time. "Keep. Stay. Away." The candles flickered, casting strange shadows across the room, and I felt a sense of dread settle over me. "Stay away? From what?" I whispered, not really expecting an answer. But the planchette moved again, quick and sharp, like it was suddenly impatient. "Downstairs." I looked at Tom, my heart pounding. "What's downstairs?" He shrugged, looking just as confused as I was. "It's just the basement," he muttered, though there was a tremor in his voice. "Old stuff, some furniture. My grandmother said we shouldn't mess with it." A sudden creak sounded from below us, as if something heavy was moving. We both froze, staring at each other in disbelief. "Okay," I whispered, my voice shaky. "This isn't funny anymore." Tom looked at the board, then back at me, a flash of worry crossing his face. I think we should stop." But before he could pull his hands away, the planchette shot across the board, spelling out a final chilling message. "Find it." The room fell into a tense silence. I could feel the fear tightening in my chest, but something about the message gnawed at me, pulling me deeper into a curiosity I couldn't explain. I glanced at Tom. We could just look. Just to make sure." He hesitated, then gave a short nod, his face pale. "All right, let's make it quick." We left the board on the floor and made our way down the narrow staircase to the basement. The air grew colder as we descended, and a faint, musty smell filled the air. The basement was mostly storage, filled with dusty furniture and old boxes stacked high against the walls. We looked around, unsure of what we were supposed to find. But then I noticed something. A small wooden chest in the far corner, half hidden under an old blanket. "Look," I whispered, pointing toward it. "Maybe that's what she wanted us to find." Tom hesitated, then crossed the room and lifted the blanket, revealing the chest fully. He tugged at the lid, and after a moment, it creaked open. Inside were old photographs, papers, and a small, weathered journal. Tom picked up one of the photos, holding it up to the dim light. It was a picture of a young woman with sad eyes, wearing a white dress. On the back, a name was scrawled in faded ink, Sophia. This must be her," Tom whispered, his voice filled with awe. I leaned in, feeling an inexplicable sadness as I looked at the photo. "What do you think happened to her?" He shrugged, but then something caught his eye. At the bottom of the chest was a small locket, tarnished with age. He picked it up and opened it, revealing a tiny picture of Sophia again, this time with another person. A man. A shiver ran through me as I noticed the resemblance. "Tom, he looks like you." Tom's face went pale. It must be a coincidence. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. The resemblance was uncanny. Suddenly, the basement door creaked shut, and a soft whisper filled the air, drifting around us like a sigh. We both froze, listening as the faint voice grew louder, forming words that sent chills down my spine. "He must know." The words faded, leaving us in silence. Tom grabbed my hand and we raced back upstairs, slamming the basement door behind us. We didn't stop running until we were back in the living room, gasping for breath. The Ouija board lay on the floor, its planchette resting on goodbye, even though we hadn't moved it there ourselves. "Do you think she just wanted us to know her story?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Tom looked at the board, then back at me, his face still pale. "Maybe, but let's not mess with that again." We left the Ouija board in his grandmother's attic the next day and didn't talk about it again. But sometimes, when I look at Tom, I can't shake the feeling that Sophia's spirit somehow recognized him, that she was trying to tell him something, a secret buried in the past, hidden in the face of a man who looked just like someone she'd once loved. The entity beneath. When my roommate Emily suggested we try using the Ouija board she'd borrowed from her cousin, I was hesitant. We'd both heard horror stories about Ouija boards, but she convinced me it would be harmless. "Think of it like a ghost hunting game," she said with a grin. We had no idea what we were inviting into our home that night. We decided to play late, after midnight, to increase our chances. Our apartment was a cozy one-bedroom, but Emily insisted on doing it in my room, saying my space felt more atmospheric. I didn't love the idea, but she was already setting up candles around the board, the dim light casting flickering shadows over the walls. We sat across from each other, cross-legged on the floor with the board between us. The candles flickered, and the apartment felt still, as though something was waiting. "Okay," she said, taking a deep breath. "Let's start. Are you ready?" I hesitated, but nodded, placing my fingers lightly on the planchette. She did the same, her hands slightly shaking. "Is there anyone here with us?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. For a few moments, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the planchette began to move. I stared at it, my heart pounding as it slid across the board, stopping at yes. We both exchanged a look, our eyes wide with disbelief. I was about to pull my fingers away, but Emily gave me a stern look. "Let's keep going," she said. "It's probably just random, right?" "Yeah, right," I murmured, though my fingers were cold with fear. Emily leaned forward, trying to keep her voice steady. "What's your name?" The planchette moved again, this time more smoothly, spelling out a single word. "Asmodeus." I froze, an icy chill crawling down my spine. I didn't know much about demons, but I'd read that name before in some mythology book. I glanced at Emily, who looked just as spooked. "Do you know what that means?" I whispered. She shook her head slowly, her eyes fixed on the board. Maybe it's just a coincidence. But something about it felt wrong, deeply wrong. Emily cleared her throat and asked another question, her voice a little shaky. "Asmodeus, why are you here?" The planchette moved again, this time faster, almost impatiently. "To play." My heart raced as the words settled over us. I suddenly wanted to end it, to say goodbye and put the board away. But Emily, driven by morbid curiosity, asked one more question. "What kind of game?" The planchette shot across the board almost violently, spelling out a single word. "Hide." "Hide?" I asked, my voice trembling. What does that mean?" Without warning, a gust of wind blew through the room, snuffing out the candles. We both screamed, scrambling to relight them. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the lighter. When the candles flickered back to life, I saw it. Every object on my dresser had been pushed to the edge, teetering dangerously. Then, with a loud crash, my books and perfume bottles fell to the floor. I gasped, backing away as the objects scattered across the room. This isn't normal," I whispered, my voice shaking. "We need to end this." But Emily's face was pale, her eyes fixed on the board. "I don't think it wants us to." At that moment, a deep scratching sound echoed from under the bed. My heart pounded as I stared at the floor, terror locking me in place. I couldn't see anything beneath the bed, but the scratching grew louder, relentless, like claws scraping against wood. Emily reached for the board, but before she could say goodbye, the planchette jerked violently and slid to no. A low, guttural growl filled the room, making the walls vibrate. We both stumbled back, watching in horror as the bed shook, the mattress sinking in spots, as if something heavy was crawling beneath it. "We have to leave," I whispered, my voice barely audible. But just as we turned to run, the door slammed shut, trapping us inside. The air grew thick, oppressive, as if something was breathing down our necks. I glanced at Emily, who looked as terrified as I felt, her eyes wide with fear. Suddenly, the room grew silent. The scratching stopped, the growling faded, and the temperature dropped sharply. I could see my breath fogging in front of me, tiny puffs of air in the candlelight. Then, from the shadows beneath the bed, a voice hissed, low and raspy, like nails scraping across metal. "Sarah!" I froze, unable to move, as the voice called my name again, drawn out and mocking. "Sarah, come closer." I took a shaky step back, clutching Emily's hand as we stared at the bed. I wanted to look away, but something compelled me to stare into the darkness beneath, drawn to the shadows where the voice had come from. A face appeared, just barely visible under the bed, a twisted demonic visage with sunken eyes and a wide, crooked grin, watching us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. It spoke again, its voice dripping with malice. "You invited me." I tore my gaze away, pulling Emily toward the door. "We have to get out of here." But as we tried to open the door, A force pushed it closed, keeping us trapped. I banged on the door, screaming, but no one could hear us. Emily clutched my arm, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. A sudden pounding came from the walls, a rhythmic, violent knocking that seemed to come from every direction at once. It felt as though the entire room was alive, vibrating with malevolent energy, pressing down on us like a weight. Then, the bed began to shake, the mattress lifting slightly as though something massive was crawling beneath it, moving closer. I glanced down, unable to look away, and saw the shape of a hand reaching out from the shadows, its fingers long and clawed, scraping against the floorboards. The voice whispered again, louder this time. "Sarah, Emily, don't you want to play?" I screamed, yanking at the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. Emily joined me, pulling with all her strength, and finally, the door burst open. We stumbled out, slamming the door behind us. We didn't stop running until we were outside, gasping for breath, our hands still trembling. "What? What was that?" Emily whispered, her voice shaking. "I don't know," I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. "But we shouldn't have invited it in." We left the Ouija board inside, refusing to go back for it. That night I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the faint sound of scratching, like claws scraping beneath the bed. A few nights later, I woke to a familiar chill in my room. I glanced around, my heart racing, and saw nothing out of place. But as I lay there listening, I heard a soft voice whisper my name from beneath the bed, and I knew it hadn't really left. Playful Visitor. I don't think we realized how much we were tempting fate that night. I was 15 and my brother Ethan was 12, both too old to believe in silly games and ghost stories, until we found the Ouija board in the attic. Our parents had gone out for a late dinner, leaving us alone for the night, and we'd exhausted every other form of entertainment. The Ouija board seemed like the perfect way to pass time and laugh off our fears. We brought it downstairs, lighting a few candles to set the mood, not thinking about what could go wrong. The only rule I remembered was that we were supposed to say goodbye. I brushed it off, thinking it was just another superstition, but a chill prickled over my skin as Ethan placed the planchette on the board. "Are there any spirits here with us?" I asked, keeping my tone playful. We both pressed our fingers to the planchette, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. Just silence, the soft crackling of the candles, and our shallow breaths. Ethan looked up at me with a shrug. "This is dumb." But then the planchette began to move, slowly, dragging beneath our fingertips to yes. My heart stuttered, and I laughed nervously, glancing at Ethan. "Did you just—" "No way," he whispered. His eyes were wide, the look in them sending a shiver through me. I tried to convince myself he was just messing around, but Ethan wasn't the type to scare easily. "Who are you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Again, the planchette moved. "Anna." "Anna?" Ethan whispered, voice barely audible. We didn't know any Anna, at least not anyone alive. The planchette stopped and silence filled the room again, pressing heavy against my ears. I tried to laugh it off, to convince myself we were just imagining things. But the board had other ideas. "Anna, are you here for a reason?" Ethan asked, voice shaking. I shot him a look, ready to tell him to stop, but I didn't have the chance. Kitchen. The planchette spelled, each letter feeling heavier and slower than the last. I couldn't take it anymore. I wanted to say goodbye, end the game, but something stopped me. It was as if the board had some kind of pull on us. "We're leaving, okay? Goodbye, Anna," I said, moving my fingers to force the planchette to goodbye. But it wouldn't move. My hands went cold, and I looked at Ethan, who was frozen in place. "We're done, okay? Goodbye," I said again, forcing my fingers harder against the planchette. It didn't budge. The candles flickered, casting shadows that seemed to stretch across the room. A sudden loud bang from the kitchen made both of us jump. I barely managed to hold back a scream as we turned to the source of the noise. The lights flickered off, plunging the room into near darkness, save for the faint glow of the candles. My heart was hammering against my ribs, and Ethan grabbed my hand. Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Before I could respond, another noise echoed through the house, a dragging scraping sound like nails across wood. The planchette under our fingers moved again, spelling out words that filled me with a sick sense of dread. "I'm coming." I pulled my hands away, breaking contact with the board, and Ethan did the same. I wanted to turn on every light in the house, grab the candles and scatter them around us like a barrier against whatever we had invited in. We barely had time to process what had just happened before the front door creaked open, making both of us freeze. Relief washed over me as I heard my mom's voice call out, "Kids, we're home!" We ran to the living room to find our parents, the lights flickering back on as we stepped away from the board. They looked at us, confused, seeing the fear on our faces. "What's wrong?" my dad asked, frowning. But before we could answer, a chill swept over the room and the lights flickered again. I turned to look back at the board on the floor, and a horrifying sight met my eyes. The planchette was moving on its own, slowly spelling out a message. Play. I couldn't breathe. My mom's hand went to her mouth, and my dad's face went pale. He marched over to the board, picking it up and snapping it in half. "This nonsense is over," he said, but even he looked shaken. The light stayed off. Shadows seemed to dance in the corners of the room, growing longer and darker, creeping towards us. Every instinct told me we'd made a terrible mistake by not finishing the session. The air was thick, heavy, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Then came a soft whisper, like a breeze, but with words that chilled me to my core. "You didn't say goodbye." It was a voice I didn't recognize, echoing from every corner of the house. Ethan and I held each other tightly, our parents' expressions mirroring our terror. We were all frozen, watching as the darkness seemed to pulse, to reach out for us. Then, with a wave of desperation, I broke free from my paralysis. I pulled Ethan back to the Ouija board, even though it was broken, and shouted, "We have to finish it! We have to say goodbye!" Our parents watched, horrified but unable to stop us. We forced the two broken halves of the board together and placed the planchette in the center, our hands trembling. The shadows seemed to grow taller, reaching down toward us, and a cold wind swept through the room, making the candles flicker dangerously. "Goodbye, Anna," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I pushed the planchette, and this time, it moved. I felt Ethan's fingers on mine, and together, we forced the planchette over the word goodbye. The moment we did, the lights stopped flickering, the shadows retreated, and a suffocating stillness settled over the room. We stayed there, staring at the board, breathing heavily. The house was quiet, too quiet, as if the very air was holding its breath. Mum and Dad finally moved, their faces pale but relieved. They didn't say anything, just hugged us, a silence settling between us that no one wanted to break. That night, I lay in bed, clutching my blankets, unable to close my eyes. The memory of that cold voice echoed in my mind, haunting me. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had barely escaped something dark, something that had almost pulled us into a nightmare we'd never wake up from. The board was gone the next day. Dad said he'd thrown it in the dumpster, but sometimes late at night, I can still hear the faint scrape of nails against wood, the whispered words, "You didn't say goodbye." But we did, and for now at least that seems to be enough. You made it through the darkness. Bloody subscribe for more chills and have a hauntingly good night.